I'm Tom Morello, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hello, Steve.
And the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. Hold on to your nose and stomachs, listeners. We've got a real show today.
That's right. Would you consider open pits of animal waste next to your home to be a nuisance? How about an ever-present stench of rotting flesh? Or infectious diseases contaminating your water supply? Well, if your neighbor is a pig farm run by Smithfield Foods, you can expect to be pretty annoyed. Our guest today will be attorney Lisa Wallace, who brought a nuisance suit against Smithfield Foods in North Carolina, and author Corban Addison, whose new book, Wastelands, The True Story of Farm Country on Trial, tells the tale of that court battle and the circumstances leading to it. It's both a sprawling story about the history of agriculture in America, the geopolitics of the pork industry, legislative capture by big ag, and the impact of agricultural pollution. And it's also a deeply personal narrative of the families whose homes, livelihoods, and health were destroyed by a bunch of greedy pigs, not the four-legged kind. We're going to be spending the entire hour with Mona and Corban. And as always, somewhere we'll find a break. We'll check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's get right to it. When Big Ag's cronies are defaming you as bank robbers, pimps, and a blight, you might be doing something right. David?
Lisa Wallace is a North Carolina attorney who has successfully brought and litigated numerous significant personal injury, wrongful death, defective drug, asbestos, class action, and mass tort claims. She and her litigation team brought a lawsuit against the hog production component of Smithfield Foods, winning more than $500 million in damages for the facility's North Carolina neighbors. Also joining us is Corban Addison. He is an attorney, an activist, an internationally best-selling novelist, and the author of Wastelands, The True Story of Farm Country on Trial. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Lisa Wallace and Corban Addison.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Welcome indeed. Just another footnote. Lisa Wallace is one of the founders of the American Museum of Tort Law in Connecticut, the only law museum of any kind, I believe, in the world, not to mention the only tort museum in the world. And I might add that Corban Addison's depiction of what we're going to talk about is so dramatic that it almost seems like it's heading for a Hollywood movie, like Civil Action. Is that a possibility, Corban?
Oh, I certainly hope so, Ralph. I think it would be awesome. And I know Mona hopes so, too. We've definitely been having conversations.
Yeah, and there are parts of the book that are really flourishing in terms of their description of eastern North Carolina and the impact that the concentrated hog industry has on the animals, the workers, and of course the neighbors. Now, this is an important question just to lay the groundwork, because a lot of people aren't familiar with the last quarter century replacement of small hog farmers in places like Iowa and North Carolina with massive concentrated industrial hog farms from 15,000 hogs a firm on up. Lisa, could you describe the scene that you had to analyze before you filed your nuisance lawsuit against Smithfield Farms and other defendants? Could you describe the scene in eastern North Carolina?
We started looking in this case in 2013. And if you flew over, which we did in a small plane over eastern North Carolina, you would have seen how over the years there were no longer individual hog farms. Back in 1972, for example, in North Carolina, you had 18,000 individual hog farms that were owned primarily by families and individuals to feed their families. And by 1992, you had only 4,000 hog farms. So as many as 10,000 small business owners and farmers had gone out of business. And now you see CAFOs, these concentrated animal factories, flying overhead. You can look down and you can see them virtually everywhere you look. And there will be buildings that thousands of hogs are being raised in. The hogs never literally see the light of day. And you will see something called lagoons. And these are often unlined, massive, open air storage facilities. They look like football fields where there's species and urine sitting in them. So it's actually a very, very sad sight to see.
And when you were approached by some of the families, you were confronted at almost insuperable obstacle, because it's very hard to make a connection of the enormous odor that comes from the concentration of these pigs, which we'll describe in some detail, into the areas where people lived, into their living rooms, into their bedrooms, into their back door gardens. It was just a constant stench of overwhelming intensity that floated from these lagoons and the spraying of the material on nearby lands. How can you prove a connection between the environmental impact of these pig farms and the health of these people? Very difficult. You were confronted with, well, how can you protect the workers? Well, we know all about workers' compensation laws and their limitations at the state level. So you chose the ancient doctrine, as Judge Wilkinson pointed out in his opinion, which we'll get to, in the Fourth Circuit. You applied the ancient doctrine of nuisance. Can you explain that?
Yes, well, actually, it's the first tort claim that became available in this country back to 1705. One of the most basic constitutional rights of everyone in the United States is the right to use and enjoy their property. And it's obvious that if you have thousands of hogs and you have odors that come and go and are unpredictable, and buzzards and flies, and truck traffic 24/7, clearly the neighbors were having an interference with their use and enjoyment of their property. So it actually was a property claim. A company should never get a free pass to ruin someone's use and enjoyment of their property. And what was so concerning to me was the primary neighborhoods that these lagoons and these hog factories were being built in were in neighborhoods of people with limited means and of minorities of color. And obviously you could even see that as you flew in the air. So it seemed to be both an environmental issue, a health issue, and a racial injustice issue all in one.
Well, just reading from Corban's book, Wastelands, I caught a passage that sort of conveys the detail that Corban brought here. This is all about people, listeners, real people, not virtual reality. And on page 35, he has this small passage. But the stories confirm for them that the problems down east are neither invented nor overblown. The hog farms are right there, beside the neighbors' homes, like alien ships descended from the sky. For plaintiffs like Elsie Herring, a spray field is only steps away from their front porch. For Violent Branch, it's just across the road. Widow Mcgowan could lob a stone from his yard and hit the hog farmer's dead box. And Woodall's neighbors, Linnell and Georgia Farland, wake up every morning beside 3,000 hogs and a cesspool of waste, end quote. Corban, you were really taken by this. You're a novelist, and you have not up to now written a major nonfiction work, but I was taken by your dedication at the beginning of the book, which I want to quote. For the neighbors who taught me what it means to love one patch of earth and sky more than the world entire, and for the lawyers who showed me the place where justice and mercy meet, and who with passion and patience brought about a miracle, end quote. So let me put this question to you. To what extent were you astonished by the greed, power, brutality, the willingness of the hog industry to get the state legislature, which was under their control largely, to pass a bill that would have rubbed out the litigation that Lisa Wallace and other lawyers brought, and in addition, eliminated the nuisance action against these powerful pig farms? Did this surprise you, horrify you? Could you characterize your reaction to the formidable industry that most plaintiff lawyers would never have tackled, but Mona Lisa Wallace is not most plaintiff lawyers. Can you give us a characterization?
Sure. I will just underscore that and highlight it for the audience. Mona is definitely not just anybody. To be honest, at this point in time in America in 2022, I can't say I'm shocked anymore by corporate malfeasance, by the attempt of the powerful to oppress and oppress and oppress and oppress and use every means at their disposal to oppress the poor, the disenfranchised, and to keep, those folks down. So I can't say that I was shocked, but there definitely were moments when I delved into, the political power brokering that went on where it was hard to believe that it was true. It felt to me like the sort of thing that a novelist would make up and, where you say, that fiction is stranger than truth. And sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. And I definitely felt that way, as I was exploring the individual personalities involved, both at the State House and, behind the corporate veil at Smithfield. So I was not by any means surprised at the level of corporate malfeasance and at the, corporate capture of the state houses. But I definitely felt at moments as if I was witnessing something that I might have invented in a novel, not witnessing in retrospect something that actually happened. Unfortunately, North Carolina has been subject to corporate capture in the ag industry for a long time. And while there really aren't that many representatives that represent the world down east, the company Smithfield has an enormous amount of clout. And they do so, largely because they've told a really compelling story for a long time, that they represent the little guy, that they represent the family farmer. And, what was so unique about this particular case is that it really pierced that illusion and revealed the truth for the world to see, which is that this is not about greedy trial lawyers going after the bread and butter of small family farmers, but rather it's about multi-billion-dollar Chinese-owned, corporate behemoth spraying excrement onto the homes of mostly low-income Black neighbors, many of whom trace their ancestry on the land back 100 years, 150 years back, even to the antebellum days. And once I think Mona and her team were able to really tell the story truthfully through these cases, the folks at the State House, at least some of the more courageous Republicans were willing to say, to Smithfield, what, your story doesn't hold water anymore. And that's ultimately what won the day in the story that I tell in the book. It's quite a remarkable story and just a kind of subplot of the larger story. But the way that it turned out was so dramatic. And I thought, my golly, I'm going to spill a bit of ink on this particular subplot because it's really compelling.
Well, there were 5 trials, each trial representing a few of the families over a period of time. And just to provide the context, Smithfield Foods and their lawyers and propagandists tried to put the smaller pig farmers they deal with up in front, saying, look what you're doing, you're trying to put these out of business. Let's just start with the relation between Smithfield Foods and these hog farmers. They have a contract with these hog farmers. It's a very one-sided contract in favor of Smithfield. They provide the little piglets, I understand, at about 40 pounds. And they send them over to these smaller pig farms. Well, they're not so small, actually. There are thousands of pigs. But by comparison with Smithfield, these pig farms are small. And then they're fattened up to about 7 times the size, to about 280 pounds per pig before they're sent off to slaughter. They are so crowded they can barely turn around, crushed together. Quite a few of them die, and there are trucks that pick up the dead carcasses and called dead boxes. They're usually transported at night when people aren't around to watch this grisly evacuation. Explain the relationship any further and tell us what is on the public record here.
Well, Ralph, I think the evidence, we had 5 federal trials, and Corban does an incredible job of describing a lot of very, very nerve-wracking, I guess. There were so many times that the cases could have been dismissed and motions were filed against us, and so many times legislation was passed. So it was a very, very, very difficult case. But the evidence showed that really we did not sue the farmers in federal court or the contract growers. Our lawsuit was against Murphy Brown, and the evidence showed that it was Murphy Brown who decided what hogs would go in the individual farms, where those farms would be located. It was Murphy Brown that owned and controlled the trucks and the truck schedule. They provided the feed, they provided the veterinarians, they provided the operating procedures. They essentially told the contract growers or the farmers exactly what they had to do and when they had to do it, and the procedures that they had to use. So it was Smithfield or Murphy Brown who continued to insist that they use the type of spray lagoon system that they continue even to use today. Actually, the contract grower, really all he did or she did was supply the labor, the land, and the buildings. But unfortunately, the burden of dealing with the waste was imposed on the contract grower or the farmer, which was, in our opinion, unbelievably unreasonable and unfair to the farmer.
Now, I want to read from the amazing opinion of Judge Wilkinson, who's a very well-known appellate judge. He's written a lot of books. He's a deep conservative, but he's very thoughtful, not like what some conservative judges are today. He's really considered quite a scholar. And in his concurring opinion with Judge Thacker, which approved what you won at the trial level, which we'll get to, I thought his description was so amazing. The whole opinion could be put out in a published pamphlet to describe what was going on. So, listeners, bear with me because you've probably never heard this description of the concentrated pig farming, industrial pig farming, which operates in Iowa and North Carolina and elsewhere. And I want to quote from the judge's opinion on page 71. Here goes, quote, "The warp is the human-hog relationship, and the root of the nuisance in this suit lay in the deplorable conditions of confinement prevailing at Kinlaw," that's the farm, "conditions that there is no reason to suppose were unique to that facility. Confinement defined life for the over 14,000 hogs, all of which Murphy Brown owned, that Kinlaw Farms had crammed into its 12 confinement sheds. Consistent with Kinlaw's role as a finishing facility, hogs arrived at around 40 pounds to be fattened to over 7 times their starting weight. The one thing that never grew with the hogs, though, was the size of their indoor pens. Even though hogs grow bigger now, the pen's design has not changed a whit in 25 years. The sad fate of Kinlaw's hogs was therefore to remain in these densely packed pens from the time they arrived to the time they were shipped for slaughter, straining in vain as their increasing girth slowly but surely reduced them to almost suffocating closeness. To manage waste under such conditions, the concrete floors of Kinlaw's sheds were partially slatted. These slats were supposed to allow the hogs' feces and urine to fall through to a gutter system below. But due to the close confinement just described, hogs were often packed too tightly to defecate over the slats. As a result, waste built up, and as photos of Kinlaw's facilities show, hogs ended up covered in feces. The waste that did make it through the slats to the gutter system was flushed 4 to 6 times a day to one of 3 nearby open-air lagoons, essentially 3 uncovered 8 million gallon cesspools. From there, the waste material was sprayed into the air to fertilize nearby crops, a waste disposal method known as the lagoon and spray field system. The dangers endemic to such appalling conditions always manifested first in animal suffering. Ineluctably, however, the ripples of dysfunction would reach farm workers and at last members of the surrounding community. To start, take the basic issue of air quality, When pigs defecated, gases accumulated in their sheds, but at certain concentrations only possible under conditions of overcrowded indoor confinement. These gases could become toxic, even fatal, to the hogs. To prevent its hogs from dying in their own wind, Kinlaw ventilated these sheds by opening curtains that released these noxious fumes unfiltered into the air outside. End quote. That's Judge Wilkinson's commentary, and well documented. And a little few paragraphs later, he said, all of these problems are preventable. They weren't necessary. Well, if they were preventable, Lisa Wallace, why were they prevalent? What was the motivation for such cruelty, not only to the pigs, to their own workers, and to their own status in the community, not to mention the nearby families?
Well, obviously, it was our position, and we believe that the juries must have agreed with us, that these were preventable conditions. There were so many things that could have been changed to not have created the problem at all. First, the technology. It's been known for many years now that there's much better technology, something called the Terra Blue system and others that could have significantly reduced the odors. Additionally, they could have covered the lagoons. Of course, it shouldn't have been unlined lagoons to begin with. There was a hero in our book, and this gentleman is a hero in life. His name is Tom Butler. Tom Butler is today a hog farmer in North Carolina, a contract grower, and he took it upon himself when his neighbors complained to cover his lagoons and to take all types of actions, including having larger and better bins for the animals themselves to allow them some dignity, if you could use that word. So there were a lot of things that could have been done. And I believe personally, and I believe the evidence showed that it was primarily a matter of finances, that if you would undertake changes in the industry in one facility, it would over time necessitate taking those changes at others. And I believe that's just simply over the years why this outdated, terrible lagoon and spray system has been continued by the industry.
Another thing that I was looking for in the book is the role of the press. There must have been some steady coverage of the press, and some of it must have been quite supportive. Corban, you want to elaborate on that? The press certainly didn't ignore the lawsuits in the courtroom or the run-up to the trials and the outrageous behavior of the state legislators trying to rub out the litigation and rub out the cause of action, not to mention the regular propaganda bellows of Smithfield and its allies. What was the nature of the press here, and did it help or hinder?
Definitely the media didn't ignore the story. There were quite a number of major pieces that were written across time about this issue. I mean, the Washington Post covered it, the Rolling Stone covered it, I believe Wall Street Journal covered it. And then, of course, there were the Raleigh News and Observer, which has a long-standing history of covering the issue going back to its Pulitzer Prize-winning series, Boss Hog, back in the 90s. There were some smaller, outlets as well that were very faithful in covering it. And yes, I think it was helpful. I think, what I described in the book, though, is that, Smithfield's perspective of the media has always been, they don't understand what we do. It's liberal bias against small family farmers. And so they had the alternative media that they would churn out blog posts and social media posts on Facebook from their nonprofit group that they created and funded and made it look like it was independent when it wasn't. There was a furor that broke out in the middle of the trials after the first verdict that was really quite dramatic. And actually, it led to death threats. It led to Judge Britt, the trial judge, to enter what is a really rare kind of restraint on communications by the parties and the lawyers. And that ultimately was struck down by the Fourth Circuit as a gag order. Though when I look back at what Judge Britt did, I think he was doing the very best that he could to try to tamp down what was really an incendiary situation. That was not being fueled by the mainstream media. That was being fueled by Smithfield's aligned groups. that were, really creating an uproar in the community down east, to the point where witnesses were being intimidated, where people were being targeted on Facebook with advertisements. And there was real concern about the possibility that the jury would be tainted by all of this, because, of course, jurors, they weren't sequestered. They went home every night and they got cell phones, and there's no way for them, I guess they could turn off the radio in the car, but we live in a world being bombarded with different sources of information. And so there's real concern about the possibility of all that. So that's really the role the media played. I mean, on the side of, I think, truth and justice, there were some really good stories written. Defending Smithfield, there was a whole lot of really interesting kind of alternative fact kind of stories that I included in the book, because I thought the whole thing was quite dramatic.
Well, I thought that the judge here was quite a central figure. He was a conservative, older judge, I believe his early 80s, Judge William Earl Britt, B-R-I-T-T. And he handled matters, according to your narration, really extremely judiciously. And he was up against massive social media hate mail against everybody who was challenging the pig industry, including the judge, the potential jurors, the lawyers, the families. In England, this would have been immediate contempt of court. That is, in England, you file a tort case and you walk out of the courtroom and you say anything antagonistic or pejorative about the judge and the people in the court, the judge will cite you for contempt. They don't have the niceties of the First Amendment when it comes to disparaging publicly trials, especially in such extreme terms. So that's part of the pressure that Lisa Wallace and the lawyers had to take, and of course the families and everybody concerned. But it was very fortunate that these trials, at least most of them, drew Judge Britt. The defendant corporations and their corporate lawyers really tried to get them out of there, and they tried everything, and they failed. So now I want to get to the trials. And Lisa Wallace, can you just give our listeners, I don't think many of them eat pork, but tens of millions of people in the U.S. eat pork, and they don't have much of an idea of how this pork chop reached them and what the nature of the hog industry is like. I think it might turn their stomach if they saw some of it portrayed on television. But could you describe, you filed the case, describe your diligent trial lawyer from Texas, and just take it from there. Give us a 3, 4, 5-minute summary of how you wound up in front of the jury, and then what did the jury decide?
Okay, so basically, thank you for mentioning Mike Keskey, a lawyer out of state from Texas, is an incredible trial lawyer, and he was virtually our only co-counsel in the case. So it was Wallace and Graham. We are Salisbury, North Carolina, always lived in North Carolina, small town firm. And honestly, I have to say that you ask about why we focus so much on property rights. As a mother and a grandmother myself, I cannot imagine having a home where you didn't know when there would be unpredictable odors or smells that would keep you from going out into your yard, or having your grandchildren outside and the odors were just overwhelming and they had to come in, especially for people who live in smaller homes and have big families in Eastern North Carolina where it's very, very hot. So there was constant on and off unpredictable odor, truck traffic, dead hog trucks that were coming by day and night, flies, gnats, and those type of problems that did significantly interfere with these wonderful people's abilities to use their homes. And their homes meant just as much or more to them than I can say the homes of anyone else. And they had just as much right to use and enjoy them. So we did have 5 federal trials. Our clients did come to court. They had to live in Raleigh, North Carolina, stay in a hotel during the week, go into courtrooms where there would be hundreds of people from the industry or on the half of the industry, there in court against them, and there would be generally very few on our side of the courtroom. There were meetings, open meetings that the industry sponsored at the fairgrounds. It was all of those kinds of things going on during our trials. And essentially, we let people tell their stories of how it affected them, how when they went out, it would cause them problems with breathing or their nose running or give them a headache, those types of things from the odors. They talked about essentially their family histories, how these homes had been there generally before the hog farms came. And we based the case on science and medicine. We had a former EPA scientist who had done early work. His name is Dr. Shane Rogers for the EPA. And he actually went out and found a DNA bacteria on the homes of the neighbors, which proved, of course, the odor was there because this particular DNA particle or bacteria is the type that came only from the gut of hogs. And then we had another incredible hero, a gentleman named Dr. Steve Wing. He was from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He was an epidemiologist. He died several months before our first trial, but we preserved his testimony. And he had for decades studied the situation, as had other physicians over the years, and they had documented how all of the problems that are created by using the spray and lagoon system, they documented the problems with the environment, on children's health, as you mentioned earlier, Ralph, especially when there were schools or churches in the neighborhoods, how it affected children, how it caused people to be in a bad mood or depressed or disillusioned from having to live under those conditions. So that was essentially, again, the type of testimony. We had scientists, we had physicians, we had an epidemiologist. And I have to say that the thing that I think meant the most to me, that the lesson that I learned the most, is how important it is in this country that juries be allowed to make decisions. These people and others for decades before them had reached out to their county commissioners, to their senators, to every administrative agency they could. And only when they got to the court, and only because of the independence of the jurors, were we able to help those people. And hopefully those decisions will at least encourage the industry to make better choices in the future.
Now, we're going to get to that, how the lawsuits made them shape up their industry a little better. But tell us about the jury verdicts. Now, listeners should know that Smithfield and the other defendants were very capably represented by powerful law firms. Who was the main law firm? Can you name it, Mona?
An extremely good firm called McGuire Woods, primarily out of Virginia and out of Raleigh.
All right. And you're out of Salisbury, North Carolina, correct?
Yes, sir.
Yes. So tell us what the jury came in with. Under North Carolina law, if you ask for punitive damage, the law only allows 3 times the amount in dollars that you got for compensatory damage. Can you just explain what the juries started coming in with in trial 1, 2, 3, 4?
Yes, sir. Well, first, there were 5 federal trials, and I'm very, very happy to say that in each of those 5 federal trials, we had 12 jurors in each case, so that would be 60 jurors, and all 60 of the jurors and all 5 of the federal trials were asked the same question. The question was, did the defendant, and that was Murphy Brown, LLC, substantially and unreasonably interfere with the plaintiff's use and enjoyment of his or her property? And all 5 of the federal trials, the jurors unanimously concluded that yes, there had been a substantial and unreasonable interference. And that again was based on the testimony, as I mentioned earlier, primarily of the individuals. By the way, almost none of these individuals had ever been or set foot in a courthouse before, and almost all of them were minorities of color, of limited means. The verdicts in North Carolina, we have a mandatory cap or a limit on how much you can recover in punitive damages. It's 3 times the amount of compensatory damages, or another cap of $250,000. The first trial involved 6 individuals, and the verdict combined was $50 million. And those individuals were chosen by the plaintiff. The federal judge allowed Smithfield to choose the second group of bellwether plaintiffs or plaintiffs, and that was called the Mcgowan Case. And by the way, there were 10 in the first group in the first trial. There were 2 in the second trial. The verdict came in for $25,130,000 in the second trial. And the third trial, and that was the longest trial, if I recall, there were only 6 plaintiffs. And the verdict in that case was the largest, I believe, in North Carolina history. It was $473,500,000.
That included compensatory and punitive. And
yes,
isn't
sir.
it true that that had to be cut back because it was much more than 3 times?
Oh, yes, sir. They were very, very, very substantially reduced because of the North Carolina cap, the limit on punitive damages. And in fairness to the defendant, the verdicts were primarily, the amounts were for punitive damages as opposed to compensatory damages. The last 2 verdicts, we were successful in those cases. The jury did come in and find that there had been an unreasonable interference, but the amounts were very much less than they had been in the first 3 verdicts.
And of course, the defendants, the hog industry, appealed, and they lost in a 2-1 decision before the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. That included Judge Wilkinson's devastating concurring opinion that I read from. You settled finally the case. You weren't going to go back and retry everything. So the Smithfield came to the table, and that settlement, I take it, is confidential?
Yes, sir.
Okay. But not confidential was what you observed. Did they start cleaning up their act? Why don't you describe the deterrent effect of your many lawsuits on how they handled their business and how they reduced the mistreatment of neighbors and workers, if that was the case? Could you describe that?
Well, generally, the evidence that came out beginning in the third trial and subsequent trials, Smithfield did undertake to make some very positive changes in the way that they had been handling, particularly, for example, the traffic. Instead of the trucks coming 24 hours a day, I believe the testimony, if I recall, was they limited it to from something like 6 a.m. in the morning until 6 p.m. And on some of their farms, they did, if I recall correctly, talk about refrigerated units, meaning instead of hauling away the dead, decaying hogs and allowing them to sit out in the open air, they had refrigeration units, and I'm hopeful and I understand they're using those more and more now as part of an industry standard. And there were other things that there was testimony about that they began doing, which all were very positive steps to improve the industry. Unfortunately, generally, the lagoon and spray system has remained at most of the hog facilities. And it was our position and remained the position we had throughout the trial that it was outdated, that there was new technology, and that the new technology should definitely have been implemented, which would have improved even more the environment, the potential health risk, and certainly the odor and the problems that the neighbors faced.
Are they still using the lagoon and spray system?
Yes, they are. Although they have undertaken at some facilities significant new technology as well.
Now, here's the stunning finale of all the efforts that Mona Lisa and Mike Keskey and others have engaged in. This took several years of nonstop work, is that the North Carolina legislature, if I read the words by Corban Addison correctly, they did pass legislation in the middle of the trial. They tried to rub out your case. That failed in the legislation on a vote. but they have eliminated any future nuisance suits against this industry. Is that correct?
Essentially, the state legislature amended the Right to Farm Act, which limited the financial recovery. If anyone other than the cases that we had would bring a nuisance claim for nuisance involving an agricultural facility, the damages would be very, very significantly limited to essentially property market value.
Which in effect nullifies the use of the nuisance doctrine, because who can afford as a lawyer to take a case like that on a contingency? Because the property values, especially since these are very low-income homes, are minuscule compared to the impact on human health and the right to enjoy your premises, which is the core of your cause of action. So the state of North Carolina, in effect, said, you're not going to be able to do this anymore. And I'm sure the big pig farm industry has exuded a sigh of relief at the lack of any future lawsuits providing any deterrence to have them apply this new technology that's been available for a long time. What about the state regulators? Were they in the pockets of the hog industry and its allies in the state legislature?
The one thing I would say is that in the third trial, there was a representative of the state's Department of Environmental Quality, Christine Lawson, who testified about the state regulators, and she was the primary state regulator. And the cross-examination was absolutely devastating for the simple reason that, she's a very proud person and proud of her work and, believes in her agency's remit and believes that what they're doing is important. But it came out on cross-examination that she virtually has no power. I mean, that organization, that agency is now under the State Department of Agriculture, which is, the agricultural commissioner is a political appointment. She actually does not have the power, even when observing a violation, to immediately enjoin the behavior and stop it on a farm. She actually testified that she was overhead at one point and observed the waste being sprayed directly into a creek and actually had to call the corporate representative at Smithfield to get him to turn off the spray. Like, she actually, as a regulator, did not have the ability to do that. In addition, she testified that their budget has been slashed and slashed and slashed. So the sad thing is, Smithfield said over and over and over again, constantly drumbeat in the media, we are the most regulated industry in North Carolina. And it just came out at trial that, if that's the most regulation that there is in any industry in North Carolina, then North Carolina is the most unregulated state in the country. I just don't believe that. Unfortunately, the industry has been very effective at taking the teeth out of the tiger when it comes to regulating the ag industry and pig farming.
I'm sure some of our listeners are asking, Corban, what about the Environmental Protection Agency? What about federal agencies here?
To be honest, that is a very good question. And I did not run across, I didn't run across anything that indicated that the EPA was stepping in to take the reins from the state regulators here. And I'm not sure, I don't know enough about, EPA regulations and federal law versus state law and how it all relates to the hog farming industry. But in telling the story and in doing the research, while the EPA certainly does things, and as Mona pointed out, Dr. Shane Rogers was a EPA scientist that testified at trial, I did not see the EPA stepping in and trying to regulate this. It may be that, and Mona, you might be able to speak to this better, EPA very often is focused, as I understand it, on, water, and water pollution was not a claim here. Now, there has been vast amounts of water pollution by, in the rivers and streams and in the watershed by the hog farms, but that was not a claim in the cases. And that is something that has been a really hard thing to prove through the years. Though other lawyers have tried.
Ralph, it was my understanding that the federal agencies deferred all the responsibilities and duties of handling these types of issues to our North Carolina state agency. And as he said, the budget was so significantly reduced. At most, I think the evidence showed that there might be an annual inspection, and not always was there even an annual inspection. And then it was only a records review, and the records were generally kept by the grower or the farmer, and it was no way really to oversee whether the record keeping was accurate or not. So the inspections were virtually a very limited value, if any at all.
You did have some help with the Waterkeepers Alliance, though, didn't you, and some other environmental groups?
Yes, I cannot speak more favorably about the environmental groups that stepped in and were involved in these cases. There's a group called Southern Environmental Law Center that has a number of lawyers that was incredible, but the Waterkeeper and River Keepers, a gentleman named Rick Dove, he helped arrange for flights for decades, even years before we were involved. He and another gentleman, Larry, would fly over and report violations, whether it was contaminated water running into the oceans or the streams, or the famous fish kills that you all might have read about. But they were the ones who monitored it. I was surprised that North Carolina did not have a plane or access to aerial photography. So had it not been for the Waterkeeper and the River Keepers, and then the support of the other environmental agencies, we really would not have had the photographs and the information we had that addressed where a lot of these were located or the contamination. A lot of them, North Carolina has a real problem with low-lying land in eastern North Carolina. So these photographs and their recording was just invaluable to the case.
Last question to you, Corban. On page 385, you really end the book on a sad note. I'm tempted to read your exact words, but I don't want to. I want you to characterize that after all this effort, and there was some significant compensation paid, but it was deductible and depreciable by these corporations, as I've noted in other interviews on this program. How would you foresee the near future here of the relation between this industry and the people in eastern North Carolina?
Well, it's complex. I mean, the plaintiffs that were fortunate to have their cases see the light of a courtroom and to get to a jury verdict, the industry decided to do something that was never asked by any neighbor, never asked by the plaintiffs' lawyers, never asked by anyone, which is to depopulate the farms, those individual farms. And so I've spoken to the plaintiffs, in those 5 bellwether communities, and it feels to them like the world has been returned to them, like it's the 1960s again, before these alien ships descended from the sky, as I described. So for them, it is a kind of relief to have their clean air back and to have their community back in the way that it used to be. But of course, that was never the request. The request was for the industry to clean up its act. As Mona pointed out, there have been good changes that have been made, but the legacy lagoon and spray field system still remains in place. And we did not mention that 20 years ago, in 2000, the state North Carolina Attorney General entered into an agreement with Smithfield, requiring Smithfield to fund and study new technologies that would replace the lagoon and spray field system. And as Mona pointed out, there is technology that could be put in place, but the industry packed the economic subcommittee and was able to basically torpedo that technology on the basis that it would cost them more than their medieval legacy system. So the challenge at this moment in time is that because the courtroom doors have largely been closed, to future plaintiffs, and the Smithfield agreement is more or less dead in the water, it is going to be up to the industry to make a change on its own, unless, and I do mention this in the conclusion of the book, unless the federal government steps in, and there is a great law that is currently on the table in Congress. Cory Booker sponsored it in the Senate. Rod Khanna sponsored it in the House, called the Farm System Reform Act. And it would actually enact into federal law some of essentially the theory of corporate responsibility that was at the heart of the nuisance suits in North Carolina. And it would give the small, the farmers, the growers, an opportunity to get out of the industry with a government-funded buyback, kind of like the tobacco buybacks in past generations. And it would actually scale down the factory farming. But of course, we're in a space now, where laws like that are really, really, really hard to pass. So I end on, I think, a truthful note, which is that for some of the neighbors, the effects were transformative, profound for the industry. Unfortunately, because they have such political power, it wasn't as far-reaching a kind of remedy as the lawyers hoped. And for some communities, it kind of remains the way it's always been with some minor adjustments. I tried not to end on a sad note. I actually think that what Mona and her team accomplished, as I put it in the inscription at the beginning that you quoted, was a miracle. I mean, truly a miracle of justice. And it made the lives better for so many people. But unfortunately, there were constraints on what the law can do. And this case demonstrates that there are limits to what even, the law in the best possible hands can accomplish.
Well, as giant corporatism runs our country into the ground, the only real defiance comes from these trial lawyers in communities around the country and the Seventh Amendment right of trial by jury in the courts of the land. In open courtroom, subject to appeal, evidence on the record, people can walk into the courtroom and watch the proceedings. That's about the only thing left. The corporations have bought the legislatures. They have dominated the judiciary at the federal level in recent years. They control the regulatory agencies. It's just the law of torts, trial by jury. Remember that, listeners. Is there anything else as we run out of time, Mona Lisa Wallace and Corban Addison, do you want to tell our listeners that we didn't cover?
Just thank you. And the words that you said for access to justice, particularly for those who can least afford it. That's why I'm very, very proud to be a lawyer, and I'm proud of the legal industry and the attorneys who give up time with their own families and who try to help others. And I encourage others to read this book, but particularly encourage authors like Corban. Corban made a great sacrifice as well, and because he chose to write this nonfiction book to tell a story that he felt should be told. And the story is sad, it's true, but it shouldn't be. So hopefully the industry will continue to improve and more authors and more stories can be told that will encourage others to support the jury system and as you said, Ralph, the tort system, because in a lot of situations, that's the only hope so many Americans have.
How about you, Corban? Any last thoughts?
Yeah, more than anything, I just feel really honored to be, the storyteller, the vessel that was able to bring this story to the world. It's a remarkable story. And I found, I've written fiction in the past. I found the writing of this book to be really rare in that I just got to spend so much time with people that I truly regard as remarkable human beings. And it comes out on the page. I wasn't making it up. I was, truly came to regard with deep affection Mona and Mike and their families, their teams regard the plaintiffs with such a deep concern. I just loved getting to go down into the community and spend time with the people. It really was a remarkable story. And in so many ways, it was better than anything I could have made up had I been writing it as fiction. So again, I feel very honored to have been able to bring this to the world.
Well, the book is Wastelands, a true story of farm country on trial by Corban Addison with a foreword by the famous John Grisham. And I would urge you listeners to gift your local library, your high school, community college, local public library, this book, as well as if you're a member of a book club, to choose it as a book to discuss and just ponder what we are looking at in this country in terms of corporate supremacy, corporate coercion, corporate control, from the elimination of our freedom of contract to our freedom to bring a case in the court of law and have a trial by jury. We've been speaking with Corban Addison, the author of the new book, Wastelands, The True Story of Farm Country on Trial, with a enthusiastic foreword by John Grisham, and with Lisa Wallace, one of the lead lawyers that brought the series of cases against the giant pig industry in eastern North Carolina. Thank you, both of you, and I hope you'll reach many millions of people with your critical message.
Thank you, Ralph, so much for asking us to be on the show and what you do for access to justice and for the tort system, your support.
Ralph, it was a real pleasure. Thank you for having us.
You're very welcome, and the best to reach the most number of people in the coming months.
We've been speaking with Lisa Wallace and Corban Addison. We will link to their work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We'd like to encourage all of our listeners to check out the latest book by Claire Nader. It's called You Are Your Own Best Teacher. This book equips tweens to develop and apply their skills as young citizens, skeptical shoppers, and lifelong learners. Go to inspiringtweens.com to learn more about the book. Up next, our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, September 2, 2022. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Wei Chen is the former compliance counsel at the Justice Department. She's currently at Ropes and Gray in Washington, D.C. We caught up with her and asked her about the state of corporate compliance in America. To start off, for most companies, if they were left to their own devices, they would not have compliance officers in their companies, Chen told Corporate Crime Reporter. For many companies, they see compliance as a department that ties your hands. Why would you want that in your company? Because someone tells you you have to have it. You don't know how many real-life stories I have heard about compliance officers who are being interviewed and are specifically told, do you understand that we will pay you, but we don't want you to do anything? I have considered writing a book about the many compliance officers who have been fired, who have been harassed, railroaded in every which way, she said. I thought about putting together a book on it. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. That's our show. I want to thank our guests again, Lisa Wallace and Corban Addison. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now for you podcast listeners. We've got more. Stay tuned for bonus material in the wrap-up. A transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour website soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph Nader's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com. To order your copy of The Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Our guest will be Dana Milbank to discuss his new book, The Destructionists, the 25-year crack-up of the Republican Party. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody.
Hi, this is Jimmy Leeward, producer of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, and welcome to the wrap-up where we continue our conversation with Lisa Wallace and Corban Addison.
There's one more fact that really astonished me. Smithfield Foods was taken over a few years ago by a Chinese conglomerate, and not just because they wanted to make money on selling pork to Americans. It turns out that the brutal factory farming methods in eastern North Carolina produced pork at half the price that pork is produced in mainland China. And so a lot of this pork is being sliced up into portions and shipped to mainland China because it's more efficient, a kind of reverse aspect to corporate managed trade these days. You know, Lisa, in reading the book, I noticed that Corban, we're talking about Wastelands, the true story of farm country on Trial by Corban Addison, foreword by John Grisham, by the way, the famous novelist of law firm activity, including plaintiff law firm activity. I've never been able to get John Grisham to respond to our invitation to come to the American Museum of Tort Law, but he gave such an enthusiastic introduction saying he wished he could have written this book. So real gripping detail. But you clearly tracked the complaint. That is, you didn't really go after the worker safety issue. You didn't go after the health consequences for these families. You were very faithful to the targeted range of the complaint based on the ancient doctrine of nuisance. And that made me wonder why, because in Judge Wilkinson's decision, he went out of his way to talk about the workers. And he said, quote, "Workers, after all, breathe the same air as the hogs they tend. Given that these gases could kill pigs, it is entirely unsurprising that," quote, and he quotes a technical medical report, "it is entirely unsurprising that," quote, "approximately 50% of workers experience one or more of the following health outcomes: bronchitis, toxic organic dust syndrome, hyperreactive airway disease, chronic mucous membrane irritation, occupational asthma, and hydrogen sulfide intoxication," end quote. Could you explain, in terms of the approach you took, why you didn't focus on other devastating effects, which, of course, would have made the overall case for the families even more outstanding?
I think the answer is pretty straightforward. I mean, the challenge of a health claim, and, you know, I'm a lawyer, and so I got this right out the gate, is that you've got to prove the link between the health condition and the cause, or the alleged cause, in this case, you know, odors and pathogens in the air. And the challenge is that any good defense attorney is going to try to break that link by pointing to, you know, other intervening or superseding causes. And, you know, when you deal with respiratory illnesses, you get into the situation, you know, do these individuals smoke? You know, if you're talking about asthma, I mean, there's just a host of challenges that you get into when you're trying to prove a health claim. And as I understand it, Mona's team looked at that carefully and said, look, there are actually, you know, there's a big bundle of problems here, but we need to make sure that we are surgically able to prove every element of our claim, because we know that the opposition is going to be fierce, and Smithfield's going to be represented by biggest law firms in the world. And so we've got to be able to make sure that, you know, we're not giving them any weaknesses, exposing any underbelly. So really they went after, you know, the most straightforward claim, which is, look, they spray stuff into the air. They have giant open air cesspools that are larger than Olympic swimming pools that are literally right next door to the neighbors. And really it's the odor that is causing the, you know, or infringing upon the people's property rights. And oh, by the way, and of course, as the plaintiffs testified, they all got to get on the stand. They talked about health issues, but those were not the essential gravamen of the complaint, entirely for the purpose of, you know, making the causation issue as easy to prove as possible.
Yeah, I understand that. And you were very faithful to the plaintiff's complaint here. But in terms of reaching a larger audience and increasing the rational outrage, it struck me that you might have spent some time on the other effects quite apart from the litigation, like on the workers. Listeners should know that it's not just the odor. It was waves of flies and other insects on people's porches, inside their homes, constantly. It was so surprising. These people were so beaten down over the years that they would tolerate something like this year after year after year, until the plaintiff lawyers came to their rescue. By the way, you know, the plaintiff lawyers operate on a contingent fee. They don't get paid by the hour. They only get paid if they win. And so this is a huge layout on the part of Mona Lisa and the other lawyers in terms of time and investment. I mean, they had to take aerial photographs, they had to do expert witnesses, they had to interview the plaintiffs, just enormous, all related in great detail. And Corban's book, by the way. Yeah, you do a lot of workers' compensation cases, Mona Lisa Wallace, and you take these harrowing worker injuries and afflictions that they endure in their workplace that nobody wants to take under the workers' compensation system. They're not very lucrative cases at all. But you've taken those cases, and I think that's what really drove your sense of mission to take the big case against Murphy Brown and Smithfield Farms. I'm sure, David, you want to ask a question or make an observation?
Yes, thank you, Ralph. Ralph, you talked about the ancient doctrine of nuisance, and now we're learning of North Carolina putting caps on nuisance suits. Well, even more ancient than the doctrine of nuisance is Judaism and Islam forbidding the the eating and touching of pork. This Supreme Court believes in religious freedom. So since traces of pork are ending up on unsuspecting neighbors inside their homes, has anyone considered a lawsuit challenging these factory farms for violating the religious freedom of people who are strictly forbidden from coming into contact with pork?
There's one that's way out for you, Mona Lisa, in terms of sheer causation. David, this is way, way away from the law of torts, and you've got to be within the law of torts to get compensatory damages. So you could try a civil liberties case under the First Amendment, but it would be a constitutional case of minimal probability. But I do like your imagination, David.
I liked it. Corban, are you still on?
I am. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Ralph, what an incredible, honestly, no one could have told the story as beautifully as he's told it. And honestly, the only reason I agreed to the book was after the fourth trial. You didn't ask me. The only reason was after the fourth trial. Throughout the whole thing, we never once spoke to the press or said anything publicly at all. And they just, every day, it was something uglier and uglier about our motives. And finally, I realized only if this story is told would it put, hopefully, pressure on them to improve and continue to improve what they were doing. So I'm hoping this book and getting the story out will encourage them to do better than they've done in the past.
And if transformed into a movie, it will reach tens of millions of people and add to the information of the public.
Honestly, any help on that would be appreciated because the story needs to be told.
It'd be the easiest script to write. I mean, Corban is virtually, he's hit all the dramatic points and the personal points, and this is something Spielberg should be interested in, and any number of people.
The documentation, we of course have all the videos. I didn't mention it, but how we had National Geographic who followed around the testing of the hogs, and inside the hog buildings, you can't imagine the footage and just the photographs where you can actually visibly see the odors coming out of the barns into the air. That type of thing.
You have far more material than they had to produce Dark Water, which is a gripping movie, which I'm sure you've seen, right? Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah. No, I couldn't agree more. I think the ideal is it turns into a limited series for like Apple TV Plus. I mean, one of the like really, gorgeously produced and 10-part or 8-part limited series that comes out like Dope Sick, and it gets seen by 10 million, 20 million people. And, that's my hope. I mean, it's harder these days than ever to make a big movie. And unfortunately, I think even in a 2.5-hour production, if they were going for, something like an Academy Award winning movie, they still would have to shorten so much of the story. So my hope and my film agent's hope is that we land somebody, a showrunner who can bring it to one of the really kind of like HBO Max or Apple TV Plus. We'll see. One thing that is really interesting, and a guy who used to run the Humane Society, Wayne Pacell, I think is his name, reached out to me. He read the book after the New York Times reviewed it. And he told me that there's actually a big lawsuit right now where the industry, it's in front of the Supreme Court on October 11. The industry challenged Prop 12, the pork industry challenged Prop 12 out in California, which was essentially, a proposition requiring meat sold in California to be gestation crate free meat. So basically, the industry's challenged that on some crazy dormant commerce clause grounds, and the Supreme Court has granted it. And so actually, it's a really great media hook. As soon as I've got a moment to spare, I'm going to write an op-ed and, get my people to place it. Because in reality, what the industry is doing is exactly what they did in North Carolina. They're trying to take away the rights of ordinary citizens. On the one hand, in North Carolina, they did it through, the political process to take away the legal rights. In California, it's the citizen right to vote. They're trying to take that away through the courts.
And Mona Lisa, we didn't even get to the anti-disparagement laws. Is there an anti-disparagement in North Carolina?
Can I just tell you this really fast? You won't even believe this. And by the way, I think Steve's on now. Bottom line, they passed like 9 laws. First, the only reason we got to court to start with was I was smart enough 3 months before I brought the lawsuit to spend 3 months and a fortune of money going and getting all the facility records. I went to the different counties and made copies of all the hog farm operations records. The minute I sued, that became confidential. A law was passed like within 3 days, and no one can ever get the records again. Then they passed an anti-gag law that made it a misdemeanor for anyone that worked on any of the farms or in any of their processing plants to share any information at all or documents or even take photographs of the plants, essentially. They passed that. Then they passed a bill that said that we had to mediate. Actually, it's the only case in the country or state of North Carolina. You have to mediate it before you even file it. I forgot to tell you that part. Then they passed a bill that said if you came back to the home and you had left, it's called coming to the nuisance, you couldn't bring a claim. And then while all this was going on, remember they had the U.S. head of agriculture coming down and the state agricultures and the man who was the lieutenant governor announcing his governorship, and the agricultural commissioner was putting everything together, and he's the one that controlled the state agency. And then finally, and literally the biggest showdown of all, they wrote a bill to completely dismiss our cases 2 days after, of course, we had gotten through the motion for summary judgment and narrowed down our claim to one for damages only for the nuisance. So you could spend hours just on how horrible the legislature was. And of course, it came out how much money the industry paid to them and all of that. So this story would be the most amazing series ever.
It proves my point. The trajectory of unopposed, concentrated corporate power is corporate fascism. They'll blow the Constitution apart and impose their own corporate fascism. And you just have given an example of how unlimited their suppression of dissent and their control of institutions that are supposed to defend the people.
Well, right, and they've done this in every state. That's what you don't understand. I mean, every state that anyone's tried to protect people who live around agricultural. And so think about this. I can bring a lawsuit for nuisance for a landfill next door or for a racetrack, but not if it's an agricultural industry. I mean, it's the most unequal, dishonest, horrific law I have ever seen. And of course, we have primarily Republican appointed judges. It went up before a 3-judge panel who we got all very conservative judges, specially appointed, I might add, and they upheld the constitutionality. So any help, honestly, I've never, Ralph, made public the kind of stuff we do, and we do incredible things. But this story, it just needs to be a movie or to get Corban on, you know, like you said, NPR or PBS or some of the Oprah Winfrey, if she would ever read this book, because Cory Booker actually came to North Carolina. And remember I was on a panel. I'll tell you who else was Ron Barber. He was involved early on with me. And you know how important he is. If Oprah ever really got this book and would read it, I really believe she would be the one that would produce it and do the incredible job. And what a time in history to do it, with the racism and the injustice and the environmental issues.
Mm-hmm. By the way, do you know about Oprah Winfrey's interaction with the meat industry years ago?
I remember she fought them, right?
Yeah. Now listen to this. She had on her program a critic of hamburgers and hot dogs and what's in them. And just the way Phil Donahue had us on, and Texas meat packers filed a multi-million-dollar suit against her. It cost her hundreds of thousands of dollars to get it thrown out. These people have no respect for anything that has the label constitutional rights.
Ralph, are there laws on the books in Texas that prevent you from besmirching the reputation of meat producers?
Yeah, that's what they did. It was anti-disparagement laws, they're called, David, which is basically saying gag laws against free speech criticism of corporate crimes.
And they're ag-gag rules. You're not allowed to send in undercover reporters with GoPro cameras because it's violating trade secrets. That's what they, in some states, you know.
Did you know
some of them are losing, they're losing in court on a lot of these these anti-disparagement, they're so blatant against free speech. But going on to the property with the undercover camera like 60 Minutes does and so on, that one is harder to defeat.
We don't want to reveal our trade secrets. That's what they say.
And that's a wrap. Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour when we welcome columnist Dana Milbank to discuss her new book, The Destructionist, the 25-year crack-up of the Republican Party. Until next time.
Stand up, you've been sitting way